The light of the second moon bled through the courtyard, glinting off the guillotine positioned in the center of the fort. Lydus studied it through the bars of his cell. The thoughts of the sun lurked in his mind. This was to be his last night in Arillion.
It's almost over.
He looked down at his wrists. Silver fur stained an off-brown from blood and stripped bare by his shackles. He dared not look at his tail in fear of what he would find. As the weeks had passed, the guards had repeatedly slammed it indoors and dropped things on it, each time temporarily paralyzing him. His focus shifted back to the guillotine.
It's better than quartering.
He angrily wiped a tear from his muzzle. Thunder rumbled in the distance, storm clouds covering the light of the moon and sending the cell into darkness. A chill ran up his spine. Was it fear? Regret? Sorrow?
No.
He was no longer alone.
Your execution is at first light, is it not, Corporal Arash?
An old husky voice asked. Lydus nodded in response, refusing to face his visitor.
I don't recognize your voice. So I suppose you're here to ask my requests for my burial, or who to give my belongings to.
He fumbled with the injuries on his wrists, feeling the frustration of his situation building once more through his body.
Or maybe you want to tell me I'm to be skinned and given to the mulebreds as a blanket.
What did you expect? I know why you murdered him. It doesn't make it right. I am here for a more important reason.
And what would that be? Execute me now and save the cleanup tomorrow?
Lydus turned into the glow of a dim red light and faced the figure. He flinched.
He's in the cell? The door's locked! Hey, how did you get in here?
This stranger stood shrouded in darkness and ignored the question, his features shadowed by a dim red glow of a stone atop his staff. Like the flicker of a flame, it cast its light across the cell, turning the slate stone walls the color of blood.
There is good in your heart, Corporal. That is why I am here.
Lydus scoffed. Good in his heart didn't matter if he was on the doorstep of the eternal sleep.
How's that working for you? You were the one asking me about my head being lopped off first thing in the morning.
A hand rose, held flat in front of him.
Lydus, given the exact same situation again, would your actions be different?
Lydus felt a warm flush run through his body. What was that supposed to mean? He couldn't relive a day. His head sunk, his ears and tail dropping. Suddenly he clenched his fist, feeling a burning sensation empower him. Enraged, he stepped, intruding on the stranger's personal space.
I had my free will taken from me. It was my choice of what was right and wrong. The plague aren't what's killing us. We're losing our minds fighting them. We have forgotten what it means to be Canids. We are becoming a monstrous creature. Just like that, we fight.
He turned away in disgust, stepping out of the stone's light.
I would do what was right,
he muttered.
Then I have found the right Canid,
the figure said.
Would you take a chance to set things right?
Why was he here? This mysterious figure made no sense. Of course he would take a chance to live. What a stupid question! Lydus placed his hand on the stone, forcing his nails into the cracks in the mortar.
You already know my answer. But what does it matter? The way the plague are advancing, we're all as good as dead anyway.
The clouds parted, and moonlight flooded through into his cell. The glow of the stranger's staff faded. Lydus turned and froze. The figure had vanished, leaving him wondering if that was a dream, or the rumors of shamans were true. Dawn approached, quicker than any day before it. Sleep seemed near impossible. The straw bedding had become more uncomfortable since his visitor. As he finally managed to sleep, footsteps thudded up the hallway. It was time. A new guard, one Lydus hadn't seen before, unlocked his cell.
"Prisoner, step forward,"
he said. Lydus complied, following the small group to the courtyard. He stopped at its entrance and looked down at his feet.
"What's the problem?"
the guard asked, turning to face Lydus.
"Whatever the issue, out with it."
the guard's friendly tone a welcome change. Lydus looked at the guard.
May I remove my boots?
The guard smiled.
You want to feel the soil beneath your feet one last time?
Lydus nodded, taking a knee, looking to the sky at the glow from the pending sunrise. Placing his feet on the grass, moisture seeped up between his toes, a primitive feeling that reminded him of better days. With each step, a different fragment of his life flashed through his mind. His mother, younger sisters, and brother, Rebecca, the Latrans he had once dated, and the memories of the warm summer nights, running through the fields with her on the farm. He stood on the grass and watched as another Canid, a Lupus just like himself, was led to the platform and placed his head in the wooden hold. A guard placed a bag over the Lupus's head. Then it was Lydus's turn. He looked up, watching the final stars fade from the sky, preparing himself for the forever of darkness to come. As he placed his head into the wooden hold, a horn sounded in the distance.
The Crown's horn? Go find out what's happening!
The executioner ordered. Footsteps thudded behind him, followed by distant shouting and the horn sounding again, but louder and closer. Oh, if only he could see. Each attempt blocked by the tight bindings of the hold. The sound of hooves thundered into the fort. The rider dismounted, yelling in Lydus's direction.
Halt the execution immediately! By order of the Crown!
Footsteps once again sounded on the platform, and the sliding of wood from the hold before it lifted free. Lydus felt a palm grab his scruff, pulling him upright, and with a glance at the rider and then to the other Lupus, confusion set in.
What is going on?
The rider handed the executioner a letter, his tail beginning to flick side to side in agitation.
This is your lucky day, prisoner.
The executioner looked up, facing the guard next to Lydus.
Escort this one to the gates at once. Place the other back in the hold.
The guard hesitated.
Are you sure?
Whatever was going on, the guard's inability to follow an order was the least of Lydus's worries. Who were these guards? Outcasts from the worst divisions?
The executioner is holding a letter from the Crown. Everyone understands the significance of it, don't they?
Yes, you invalid!
The executioner shouted. Muffled yells came from the other Canid, his pleas for mercy held within the bag. The guard turned and pushed Lydus hastily toward the gate, grabbing his boots in the process and forcefully pushing them into his chest. His ears stood alert and his eyes darting toward the gate, hunting for an answer. Why was he still alive? Surely his life wasn't worth a thing to anyone. Even Rebecca didn't stick around long after his family abandoned him. But there he stood, boots against his chest, waiting to see the one who had spared him. For now. 5 Canids rode into the fort, in shadow by the rising sun, but one stood out from the rest. Agricius, his armor that of his position, the lieutenant general, second in command of Creysil's army.
Corporal Lydus Arash, I assume,
he stated, looking down at Lydus.
Yes, sir, that is I,
he said, pulling his boots on.
Good.
He withdrew a letter from a satchel.
This morning at sunrise you are executed for the murder of your superior officer. Your rank and honors have been stripped from your corpse.
He raised his hand and pointed. Lydus turned his head, facing the other Lupus. He had been placed back in the neck-hold of the guillotine. The Lupus struggled in the confines of his prison, sighs of discomfort, fear, and regret in his cries.
Who is he?
Lydus asked, listening to the scared moans coming from the prisoner.
Just another traitor like yourself. But as far as everyone is concerned, he is Lydus Arash.
The lieutenant general nodded to the executioner. Lydus looked away as the blade fell, cutting through the flesh and bone of his substitute.
Lydus, you were visited by a stranger last night. Am I correct?
Lydus looked up.
Yes, sir. I believe so, sir.
The execution obviously hadn't fazed him, but why should it? As he said, the Canid was a traitor just like him. The lieutenant general dismounted his horse and began walking towards Lydus.
Drop the formalities and call me Arnold. Now, walk with me if you don't want to end up like the other Lupus.
Lydus quivered. Something he didn't want, but at the same time, call him Arnold? Not even the maids called him by his real name. What was different? Addressing someone so high up the ranks by their first name? The adjustment felt confronting. It was unheard of. Arnold stopped, turning his head and looked back at Lydus.
Are you aware of Clay Pass?
Lydus pondered. He knew of it. To the north on the boundaries of Creysil's borders.
I think so. It's a former stronghold at the foot of the mountains, lost to the plague 19 years ago from what I understand.
Arnold nodded.
That's correct. You, Lydus, need to go to Clay Pass and retrieve something for me.
Lydus screwed up his face. What could possibly be in that abandoned wasteland? Not even the bandits traveled there. There's a reason it's called the Plagued Lands.
That's suicide.
Arnold smirked.
Guards.
The arms of two large canids reached under Lydus's armpits, dragging him back towards the guillotine.
Wait! I'll go!
He shouted. Death on the battlefield would always be better than execution.
I knew you would see it my way, Lydus,
Arnold said as the guards released their grips on him.
The canon who visited me last night. Who was he?
The Shaman of Remorse.
The rumors were true. The shamans were still alive. That meant hope.
Arnold, if I return, do I go back to prison?
As I said before, Lydus, you died this morning. If you manage to return, you are free to go.
Free to go. He doesn't believe I'll be coming back. What exactly is so important about Clay Pass, and why am I the one who's going?
It's not just you who is going, if that is what you're asking. But to answer the question about why you are going. This mission is very important, Lydus, and I need someone who I can depend on. We can't spare anyone to travel into the Plague Lands, and the Shaman of Remorse assured me that you are the candidate to lead the journey. 3 others will accompany you, and I need you to keep an eye on them, or none of you will return.
Lydus nodded, now walking beside Arnold.
You know what happened?
He asked. Arnold shook his head.
I don't need to know the details of why you are a traitor. What little trust I have left is in the best interest of the populace of Creysil and our survival. If the shaman said you are the candidate, then you are the candidate,
he said, reaching the stables, signaling one of the guards to open the door.
I did, however, look over your reports. You have a perfect record, Lydus. Whatever you did seemed really out of character for you. But what you did is the reason you are here. You are fortunate we have a need for you and your 3 companions right now.
Lydus gulped, stepping through the door.
So, Clay Pass. What are we retrieving?
You are retrieving a unique stone. It lies on a foundation stone near the north of the town. I assume you saw the shaman's stone last night?
How could he have missed it? Of the shaman, it was about all he could remember.
Yes, the artifact had a red glow.
Arnold scoffed, his ears folding back and a serious look creeping across his face.
This isn't just any artifact. It's a stone that possesses ancient magic. It holds the hopes and the dreams of all of us. You are smart enough to understand just how desperate the situation has become. Agrelus and Thiala have fallen. Creysil is all that's left, and our borders shrink every day. We are lucky Creysil itself is a citadel. We are protected by the sheer cliffs of the highlands, but for how much longer is undetermined. You, Lydus, represent a final hope. If there was any other way, I wouldn't have spared your life.
Lydus looked at his hands.
What's the magic capable of?
Arnold smiled.
That is the real question now, Lydus, isn't it?
Lydus stepped through the door into the stables.
So who are the other 3?
He asked.
One is here. The other 2 are being retrieved as we speak.
Chains lined the walls. These weren't stables, at least not anymore. Lydus turned to face the former stalls, now appearing more like holding or processing cells. Across the room sat 2 guards in front of a large double door, playing a game of cards. The rest of the room had been converted to a combination of an armory and dry store. Swords and shields sat stockpiled for a war that already appeared lost, and several open crates of food that had begun to spoil. Beginning to relax, he leaned against the wall, the events of the morning now becoming a distant memory. His life had been spared. His tail flicked side to side and knocked the wall. He froze up, feeling a sharp jolt shoot up his spine, tears forming in his eyes, and he fell to his knees. One of the guards stood up.
Is everything okay?
Lydus whined. It hadn't been a problem until now. Given all the abuse he'd taken, he'd learned to keep it still, avoiding the paralyzing pain and discomfort, for the most part.
Yeah, everything's fine. It's just my tail.
The guard threw his cards down, crossing the room and studying the injury.
There's not a lot I can do for you. You're gonna need someone to look at it.
It wasn't like he had asked for help in the first place.
Like me.
A new and unknown female voice playfully stated. If he didn't want the help, he was going to have a difficult time avoiding it, and to think only a short time ago he had his head on the chopping block. Lydus looked up toward the voice, eyeing the back of one of the stalls. A single pointy ear extruded above the wall, with the severed base of the other visible next to it. As Lydus regathered himself and climbed to his feet, a sound caught his ear. A familiar chinking sound. Chains. She was most likely bound to the wall like he was in his early days as a prisoner. That explained why he had not seen her when he first looked over the stables. Was she also scheduled to be executed? Lydus approached the stall, making eye contact with the Canid. As he had suspected, a large shackle hung from her neck and 2 smaller ones around her wrists. She was short, with brown fur that roaned into black, with the silver markings on her belly that a typical Ferrellata had. Atop her head lay a thick mop of golden hair. She smiled, studying his tail.
Well, it seems we both have a little problem.
What's with all the chains?
Lydus asked. Her head dipped.
The gods think I'm feral, so they locked me up.
Watch out, Lupus. That little Ferrellita's a biter.
One of the guards yelled sarcastically, followed by the second guard beginning to laugh.
Wait, you bit one of them?
Lydus asked, slowly backing away from her. Maybe coming over wasn't the best of ideas. The girl nodded.
Not intentionally. They grabbed my tail. So,
Self-defense?
Lydus asked.
yeah, I've been locked up in cells for so long now, and with so many different races of Canid, I really don't know what to expect anymore.
Lydus faced the guards, their heads down, focusing on the game.
So why are you in here and not in a cell?
I'm chained up because they don't want to watch me, if that's what you're asking. Why I'm not in a cell? Beats me.
She shrugged.
Mind if I have a look at your tail?
Lydus hesitated. They didn't just send you to places like this for petty crimes.
You look pretty beat up. What's your background? Were you a soldier, or field medic or something?
I was Batman for a number of years before moving away from the capital working with an alchemist. I know a thing or two about injuries. Do you want me to look at it or not?
She didn't resemble a steward, at least not to the level of a Batman, but then again the war had brought a heavy toll on everyone. Lydus nodded and stepped forward, crouching down next to the girl.
What's your name?
Celia.
She said as she reached forward, taking hold of it.
It looks really bad. I think we're going to have to amputate it above my hand.
He pouted like a child, feeling her grasp.
I like my tail.
Pain, worse than before, shot through his body. Lydus immediately felt sick and dropped to all fours on the straw. He rolled over, looking up at Celia. She frowned. Obviously the act was deliberate, but as if she was trying to help.
The tip's definitely broken. I couldn't tell if it was just dislocated or actually busted. Sorry.
At least she tried. Laughter erupted from the guards.
We warned you, Lupus.
Celia released his tail and began to pet him sympathetically.
Well, what do I call you?
Lydus,
he said, trying to climb back to his feet, tingles running through his body. For a small canid, she had a tight grip, but also a mother's touch. Warm and welcoming, and for a moment he had forgotten where he was, only to be reminded of his situation by 2 loud knocks at the door adjacent to the guards. They stood up, placing their cards down, and moved to its side. The first guard hauled it open, saluted, then stepped aside. Arnold walked in with a much larger Lycion. He followed Arnold into the room, his large, round ears flopping with each step. The pair stopped short of Celia and Lydus.
Hey, little one. You doing okay?
The Lycion asked in a sympathetic tone. His face told the same story. It was as if he was about to ask the question, why? Why was she chained up like this? At least, that's what his face said. Celia nodded.
Yeah, this thing's a little heavy, though.
She looked up at Arnold.
Can you please get them to take this thing off?
Arnold glanced toward the guards, a look of disgust on his face.
Why is she locked up?
The guards hesitated, just stared with blank looks on their faces.
Sir, she bit.
Enough. Just unlock her. Now.
Arnold ordered. He turned to face Lydus.
I assume you two have gotten a chance to introduce each other?
Lydus nodded as the guards unlocked Celia. The Lycian stepped forward, holding his hand out toward Lydus.
The name's Flynn.
Lydus.
The introduction was cut short by muffled yelling. It echoed through the walls beyond the door.
Wow, she sounds unhappy.
Flynn chuckled. Celia looked up, rubbing the fur on her neck and her ear dropping.
Yeah, she isn't having the best of weeks, eh?
Her voice sounded angry, as if she was being led against her will. It resembled that of the whining barmaids at the Red Ox Tavern after a night on the grog.
Who is she?
The door burst open.
Esmeralda!
Both Celia and Flynn said in unison. Esmeralda lunged into the room in an angry stance, her wrists rubbed raw and large chunks of fur missing from around her neck, much the same as Lydus. He looked back at Celia and Flynn. They all had similar markings. They were all prisoners. The 2 door guards approached her, with 2 more from the passage in tow.
Oh, not today, boys. We are not doing this again, so back off,
Esmeralda yelled. This answered at least one question about her past. She definitely had no service background, and by the look of her stance, she fought dirty. Not that this was a problem for Lydus. She was easier to read than the clouds in a storm. Her advantage was these guards had no training. It struck him. It was all they were, just guards, and not soldiers like him. Lucky for the guards, they yielded, allowing her to gather herself and settle against one of the stalls. She stuck out like a broken paw. Her hair was wispy and black, blending into a deep, rusty golden color down her neck, unlike any canid he had seen before. Flynn chuckled once more.
Ezzy, have the guards got your mane in a knot? How about you come over here and let me brush your fur?
He teased. What was she, though? Flynn had pointed out one important feature, a rare one not really seen anymore. The mane. She was a Brachiosaurus. There was no doubt in his mind this is what she was, and one of the last of her kind.
Flynn, how about you give me 5 minutes to myself, or I'll come over and pull your big, floppy ears off your fat head and shove them someplace your mother wouldn't be proud of.
Lydus looked down at Celia.
Is this normal?
She nodded.
Yeah, those 2 are always at it. Well, for as long as I've been here, anyway.
Before Lydus could ask any more questions, Arnold stepped forward, calling out.
Esmeralda, over with the others.
he demanded. She huffed and climbed to her feet. As she approached the group, her eyes fixed on Lydus, then smugly looked away as she stopped behind Flynn, placing him between them.
Esmeralda, I assume you've learnt your lesson this time, or do you need to be chained back up in the hole?
No, boss. I'm okay now.
She said, shaking her head. Her response came in a casual tone, like that of an old friend. Or she had been locked up for so long now that this had become something closer to normal for her. Arnold nodded.
Good to hear. Clay Pass is your destination. Don't return until you have the stone, or I will personally see you each are quartered. 2 horses are all we can spare for your trip into the Plaguelands.
Only 2 horses? They would want to be big horses to carry the 4 of them and food too. It was at least a 3-day hike to Clay Pass from the fort, and there wasn't anything left alive that far into the highlands.
Take what you need. The horses are waiting outside. Lydus will be in charge.
Esmeralda pushed forward.
What do you mean the Kingtail's in charge? That's absurd. Look at him! He's a scrawny, sad sack of an excuse for a Lupus.
That sad sack is the reason you are not being skinned next week,
Arnold said, reaching for 2 wooden swords. He tossed one to Esmeralda.
What do you expect me to do with this?
You 2 are sorting this out right now, and if you really must know, you swing it,
Arnold said sarcastically.
A bow or a dagger would be nice. You know, I actually know how to use them, not a fucking sword.
Arnold walked over to Lydus, handing him the other sword.
I expect you to show her why I'm putting a soldier in charge, Lydus. Or she may make things very difficult for you.
Lydus took the sword in hand, readying himself. All he had to do was keep his tail clear of her, and it was fortunate she hadn't been in the room when Celia had grabbed it before, although she had noticed something was wrong. He widened his stance and lifted the sword to the guard position. Esmeralda's stance was wrong. Her grip was closer to that of a dagger. She screamed out a war cry and raced forward, swatting the weapon in a downward motion. Lydus sidestepped, watching her stumble. He swung, making contact with her leather garments. She turned, rushing once more, missing Lydus for a second time and dropping her guard. Lydus charged forward, placing a foot behind her and forcing his blade onto her chest. She fell backwards onto the floor, with Lydus pushing the wooden sword against her throat. The fight had been lost before it had even begun. She was the only one who didn't see that.
So, are we sorted now, Esmeralda?
Arnold asked. She dropped her sword, pushing Lydus off and climbing to her feet.
I guess the Kingtail can lead for now,
she muttered. Arnold nodded.
You know what is expected of you. I bid you good luck.
He turned, retreating back within the doors of the fort. Esmeralda slinked toward Flynn and whispered,
Think we could take out the remaining guards?
Flynn looked at her and smiled.
Yeah, I do. It's not them I'm worried about, though. You just got your butt whooped by a scrawny little Lupus.
Esmeralda looked at Celia, then Lydus, her eyes squinting.
What about you, Kingtail? You're the supposed leader of us, so what's the plan? Are we taking the guards or going to the pass?
It's Lydus, not Kingtail. And yes, we are going to the pass, and we are coming back.
Esmeralda pouted.
Aw, you're no fun.
For 3 days, Lydus watched the ground change from lush meadows to barrens. Ruined buildings scattered between small pockets of dead trees across the former highlands, all coated with a fine layer of ash from Mount Kurt. The journey had been uneventful, playful banter and long, cold nights, but nothing out of the ordinary. He looked down at the road with no signs of life to be seen, just cracks in the soil, and the horses kicking up dust with every step. He sucked in a long breath. The air smelled stale, but stung like the ice within a blizzard. Celia sat behind him, resting his tail on her leg, trying to keep it still. He looked over at Esmeralda and Flynn. the two larger canids packed tightly on the small horse.
What are you staring at, Kinktail?
Esmeralda asked with a grunt. Lydus looked back towards the road, hearing Flynn snigger.
Oh, leave him alone, Ezzy. He's probably wondering why the horses aren't riding us. Look, my feet almost touched the ground.
Celia giggled.
Did you expect them to give us a couple of war horses, you muppet?
Of course they hadn't been given the war horses. The two they had barely looked like they could go another step.
You've seen what happens when they get the scent of the plague. They spook worse than a Vulpus getting her hair cut.
Esmeralda laughed.
Yeah, or a mulebrid in the...
Celia's grasp tightened around Lydus's tail.
Please don't pull it.
He winced, expecting to be swamped in pain. For a Canid who knew a thing or two about pain, she unwillingly knew how to cause it. Flynn halted the horse.
Now, Ezzy, we've discussed this before. We don't talk about the mulebreds.
Esmeralda sighed, looking back at Celia with a sympathetic look on her face.
Sorry,
she muttered. Lydus felt the grip on his tail loosen and sighed in relief.
Touchy subject.
He kicked the horse back underway.
Come on, guys. Only an hour or so left, and we should be there.
Flynn followed, letting out a loud sigh.
Hey, Ezzy. Back at the fort, why did you get so worked up over Lydus leading us? I thought with my muscle and your brains, we'd have done okay under him.
Celia chuckled, whispering in Lydus's ear.
He may have the muscle, but he has the brain of a potato.
Lydus grinned.
Who are these Canids?
Esmeralda leaned back on the horse, looking towards the sky.
Boss came and saw me, told me what was happening, let me out of the hole. To be honest, I only agreed to...
Her voice stopped abruptly. Lydus pulled the horse to a halt.
What's up, Esmeralda?
In the 3 days he had known her, this was the first time she looked worried. She climbed up onto the horse's rump, scanning the horizon.
Kinktail, you know what we haven't seen the entire time that we've been out here in the Plagued Lands?
The fur on the back of Lydus's neck stood up. It wasn't worry, it was fear.
Birds!
Flynn shouted, pointing to a raven in the sky, a wide grin on his face.
Am I right?
Esmeralda smacked him over the head.
No, you idiot!
Her gaze shifted back to Lydus. He knew what she meant. He could see it in the whites of her eyes, and then he could smell it.
Hold on, Celia,
he shouted, kicking the horse and forcing it into a gallop. Like an echo, the second horse thundered behind. The stale scent of the air slowly shifted to rotten flesh and mildew. Celia released his tail, spinning around behind him, her back against his.
Can you see them?
They're coming from everywhere,
she replied. He glanced over his shoulder. Chills ran up his spine. Like a swarm of locusts, the plagued flooded onto the road behind them. The horse began to struggle under their weight, and the gallop quickly began to wear the animal down. The road widened. Flynn moved adjacent him.
A plan, Lydus. You have a plan.
He puffed, forcing the horse to continue. Lydus's eyes darted around, looking for a refuge. Something, anything to provide shelter and a place to hide. The answer came in the form of a sign, old and rotting away, but bearing the name of the town.
Don't stop! Not yet!
He yelled, as the horses sprinted toward the top of a hill.
The town's just ahead. If we keep moving, we can make it.
Cresting the hill, they looked down onto Clay Pass, and it appeared free of plague. Exactly what they needed. He looked at Flynn.
Swap with Esmeralda. When we get within the gates, jump and we will force them closed. The girls will pull the horses up.
He nodded, doing as instructed. Celia stood up, holding onto Lydus as she exchanged places on the saddle. The horse began to slow, struggling to keep going. Lydus pulled a sword from his holster, whipping it with the flat edge of the blade. The gates of the town fast approached. Lydus shifted his weight back, looked at Flynn, and prepared himself. They burst through the gate. Lydus jumped, landing on his side and jarring his tail. He struggled back to his feet, tears in his eyes. He could worry about the pain later. Right now, it was life or death, and his body knew it. Adrenaline flowed through his veins. Flynn was already sprinting towards the gates and shoved his elbow into the first, forcing it closed. The surrounding wall shuddered from the impact, dust and ash falling onto 4 plagued peasants as they spilled in through the open side. The first lunged at Lydus. He ducked as it jumped past him, landing on the ground in a snarling mess. Lydus turned, striking the neck, severing its head.
Incoming!
Celia yelled as 2 arrows flew towards him from the girls, embedding themselves in 2 more of the plagued Canids. They fell to the ground just short of Flynn. Lydus turned, hastily moving towards Flynn. He was holding the 4th plagued Canid back with his hands, attempting to break its neck.
The gate, Lydus!
He shouted. Lydus ran, putting all his force into the wooden gate. It budged forward as the snarls of the plagued began to sound from the other side. He looked back at Flynn, still struggling, and Celia and Esmeralda sprinting towards him. Lydus pushed, his tail swinging rapidly from side to side. It slipped in front of the gate, and an immediate feeling of remorse flushed through his body, followed by immense pain as one of the plagued took hold of the busted tip. He fell to his knees, letting out a cry of pain, feeling the gate begin to be pushed back. Esmeralda slammed onto the structure beside Lydus. Celia had reached Flynn, driving a blade into the final Canid. Decaying hands and fur reached through the opening along with Lydus's tail. Celia and finally Flynn placed their own weight onto the heavy wooden door. Lydus looked at Flynn, knowing he was trapped, and handed him his sword.
Cut it off!
He yelled.
Wait!
Celia called, removing her belt. Lydus couldn't believe what he had just heard.
Wait for them to infect me with the parasite? Is she crazy? We don't have time for this. Cut it off!
You'll bleed out, you idiot!
She said, pulling the belt tight around the base of his tail. She nodded to Flynn, who didn't hesitate, and within a moment a warm sensation flooded the bottom half of his torso. Lydus looked up, unable to move as the gate locked closed.
We aren't going back that way,
Esmeralda stated as he slipped from consciousness. Lydus had slipped in and out of consciousness several times since his tail had been removed. He awoke to the muffled sounds of breathing and sat up in the darkness.
Darkness. The sun had set. How long was I out for?
Hey, you're up finally. How's the tail feeling?
Celia asked, sounding relieved.
Feels like it's really badly twisted. What happened?
He asked, the combination of darkness and no tail throwing his balance off. Moonlight trickled through the cracks in the roof, and a silhouette approached, and given she had 2 ears and not one, Esmeralda.
Well, Kingtail, it seemed like one of us decided to play the hero. You pushed the horses so hard that they both died, and you decided to get your stupid tail stuck in the gate. Now the plagued are munching on it, and after you decided to have a nap, I had to take your place as the fearless leader and find a safe place to recoup. They're all lucky I was here, or you all would still be outside. It also occurred to us that you're the only one who has any idea of what we're actually looking for, other than the fact that it's a rock.
Lydus sat up.
It's not a rock. Well, it isn't a rock you would normally see. It's a gem of sorts, and it should have a distinct glow about it if it's like the one I've seen before.
Esmeralda scoffed, stamping her foot in disgust like a child.
A distinct glow? What do you mean? Like a dim candlelight?
Oi, keep it down, Ezzy.
Celia whispered.
We don't want to alert the plagued more than we already have.
Something about Esmeralda's question was odd. Had she seen the same stone? Lydus eased himself off the table, almost falling over, forgetting he didn't have a tail for balance anymore.
Esmeralda, the night before we all met, I was visited by the Shaman of Remorse. He had a stone too, but this one was red. I assume that this stone we are here to collect is similar.
Esmeralda's ears dropped and she sighed in frustration, dragging her feet towards an opening in the floor.
Kingtail, I'll make one thing clear. I'm a thief, and my goal is to take what we need so I can get back to my life. What I take from my clients is known and not based on assumptions, especially those of the shamans. When you work it out where or what that gym is, let me know. Until then, I'm going downstairs to take next watch.
Lydus shuffled towards one of the boarded windows, peering out into the town through the gaps in the planks. He could feel Celia's presence follow.
I remember her talking about a shaman when she was first captured. Something about a setup. Flynn said something too. Can I ask if the shaman asked you anything?
Lydus shook his head, not that Celia could see.
Nothing major. Just if I had a second chance, would I do things differently? That's it.
What did you say?
Yes, of course I would. Wouldn't anyone if they had all the answers?
What about Arnold? Did he say anything about the stone?
She asked.
Arnold said it held an ancient magic, and I'm guessing it has something to do with this place.
Celia's footsteps creaked across the room, followed by her weight thudding on the table, its legs jolting across the wooden floor.
This is where the battle for Creysil happened. The shaman of Foresight made her last stand in order to halt the advance of the plagued.
Her voice sounding almost upset, Lydus spun around, looking back into the darkness. They knew it was a stone they were after coming to Clay Pass. Why would she withhold that information from them? Or perhaps Celia didn't trust Esmeralda and Flynn and had to wait until they were alone. After all, they were a duo and Esmeralda was a thief.
Where was it? It's gotta be what we're here for.
He whispered loudly.
I can answer that,
Flynn said, trying to step quietly.
On the day Arctus fell, her blood spilled across the gate. The yellow light burned a mark on the side of the mountains and halted the parasite. On the foundation stone she lay, as her body faded. The light of the green and red had made it this way. With its power lost several years before, a dark figure stood looking once more. It too faded into black, leaving the stone of the Arctos at the gate that night.
Flynn's voice sounded almost poetic.
Where did you hear that? It's totally unlike you to say something like that.
Celia asked, scratching her head.
I read it in a book the day me and Ezzy were captured. I didn't think much of it at the time. It just stuck with me,
Flynn said.
The green and the red had made it this way. The red is the shaman of Remorse. The Arctos is the shaman of Foresight. Her stone cast a yellow burn on the side of the mountain. I know where the stone is.
Heavy fog filled the dawn air. Lydus, Celia, Flynn, and Esmeralda quietly moved through the town towards the northern entrance and gateway to the mountains. The first rays of sun bled through the clouds, shining onto one of the sides of the pass. It shone a fluorescent yellow leading down to the base of the mountains. Celia stood up, climbing to the top of the wall, and began to look out across the plain. Her good ear perked up, and her tail stood out. She sniffed the air.
Something about this doesn't seem right.
Lydus climbed the wall, standing next to her.
What do you mean, something doesn't seem right?
She shivered, something startling her.
Yesterday we were overrun when we pulled into the town. There were hundreds of them, and I honestly thought we were done for. We shut the gate and hid, but we never heard the plague after that. We haven't seen them this morning, and there are no signs of them in the fort. Something's really odd.
Esmeralda and Flynn both joined the gathering atop the wall. Flynn looked around, climbing higher onto the roof of another building.
Yeah, I can't even get a whiff of them today.
Lydus pondered. He had seen this before near the town of Penshaw. The plague had set an ambush, hiding downwind and waiting for the villagers escaping from Careshire on the east coast. They never saw them coming.
It's a trap. They set a trap.
Esmeralda laughed.
Don't be stupid. These are mindless drones. Their flesh is decaying. We can smell them from a long way away. You, King Till, have you lost your mind?
Lydus clenched his fist, shaking it in anger. How could she be so stupid? No wonder she was in prison. The idiot makes decisions without knowing the details. Why wasn't she dead already?
I haven't lost my mind, Esmeralda. These canids are not the mindless drones you believe them to be. They're smart and organized. When a canid becomes plagued, they don't just lose their mind. They actually think and work together. They're almost evolved. Out of all of us, I'm the only one who has fought on the front line against them and seen what they are really capable of. Do not underestimate these things or we die. Have I made myself clear?
She backed up, holding her hands in front of herself.
Whoa, settle there. I can see why the boss made you Overlord.
Flynn jumped down from the rooftop onto the wall, placing his hand on Esmeralda's shoulder.
Now, Essie, I think he has a valid point here. We never fought plagued until yesterday. We only ran from them out of Agrias.
Esmeralda nodded. Celia stepped forward.
So what do we do, Lydus?
He pointed to a small stone-like structure.
That's the foundation stone. That's where the gem will be. The plague will have positioned themselves downwind from us.
He pointed towards the foothills to the east.
The moment we leave these gates, they will come. So we take only what we need and we run. There appear to be 2 riverbeds running either side of the foundation stone. Flynn and I will use them to hold the plagued back. Esmeralda, Celia, you look for the stone. It should be yellow. Once we leave this place, there is no coming back. The plague will overrun us if we do. If we get separated, follow the riverbed south. That's the plan.
It wasn't a good plan. Really, it was the only plausible strategy. They only had one shot at this, and once the safety of the town had been left, there was no going back. Almost out of food, water, and time, they could wait no longer. Silence fell over the group as they climbed back to the ground. Flynn pulled the gate open, checking either side for plagued, then signaled with his hand it was safe to proceed. Lydus stepped out of the safety of the gate, followed by Celia and Esmeralda. The group moved slowly across the terrain, keeping low and ready to move with haste at a moment's notice. The wind shifted. Lydus stopped. A scent of rotten flesh filled the air. The fog began to clear as a large number of plagued moved in on their location.
Run!
Lydus yelled. The group sprinted towards the foundation stone. A glimmer of yellow caught Lydus's eye.
The stone is there!
He stopped at the edge of the riverbed with Flynn grinding to a halt next to him. The pair withdrew their swords, ready to strike. Celia and Esmeralda continued sprinting forward as the first of the plague reached Lydus and Flynn. Lydus's blade sliced into the first of the plagued, dropping it with a single blow.
Lydus, it's stuck!
Celia called. He looked back, seeing the girl struggling to break the stone free of its hold. Esmeralda withdrew her bow and sprinted back toward Lydus, releasing several arrows in quick succession into the pack of plagued.
Kingtail, help Celia release the stone. I'll assist Flynn.
Lydus nodded, dropping another plagued.
Thought this was supposed to be difficult.
Flynn called out. Lydus began to sprint back, replying to Flynn.
These aren't the ones we have to worry about.
Esmeralda ran past Lydus, releasing another arrow into the horde.
Who do we have to worry about, Kingtail? They're going down easy enough. There's just a lot of them.
Skidding beside Celia, Lydus jammed a dagger in between the foundation stone and the gem, levering it from its hold. He heaved, straining and gritting his teeth. The gem broke free, causing him to stumble backwards. He paused, looking back at Flynn and Esmeralda, and shouted,
Them! The soldiers! The plagued soldiers!
Pointing towards a new group of plagued covered in armor. Lydus pushed, feeling the stone break free from its grips, falling forward onto Celia.
Let's go!
She yelled, clambering to her feet.
We got it! Run!
Lydus shouted to Esmeralda and Flynn. He watched as the pair jumped into the riverbed, Lydus and Celia jumping into the opposite, and began to run in an attempt to escape. Lydus panted, his legs burned and his arms ached from the sprint to safety. Sweat ran down his muzzle, dripping from the tip of his nose. His ears stood attentively, the adrenaline slowly draining from his body. He breathed a loud sigh of relief that echoed off the cave walls. He lifted his nose towards the entrance in search of the plagued in tow. Fortunately, the air smelled crisp and clear.
Celia, were we followed?
He asked, taking deep breaths between the words. She shook her head, undoing the heavy chain armor, allowing it to crash to the ground. The armor reflected the light from the cave's entrance onto her golden fur. Her one good ear stood tall and alert, the base of the other copying the same pose. The leather undergarments appeared wet.
Likely covered in sweat.
His certainly felt that way. With his attention back towards the cave's entrance, he swallowed.
Did you get it? Please tell me you got it.
Yeah, I got it. But was it worth it? We lost Flynn and Ezzy. I hope they're okay. Lydus, we should have gone back.
Going back would have been suicide. At least Flynn and Esmeralda were together. If they had any chance of survival, it was as a pair.
That's not important right now. If we were followed, is what matters.
Celia walked to the cave's entrance, lifting her muzzle and flaring her nostrils.
I can't smell them.
This wasn't a bad thing. They had left their own scent markings, so if they were still alive, it would be easier to find them than the other way around. Celia sat against the cave wall, holding her satchel in front of her.
Can I see it?
Lydus asked, his tail stub flicking side to side in relieved excitement. He overbalanced, stumbling forward. Celia looked up, a smile appearing on her face.
It'll take you a few days to adjust to not having it. Here.
She reached into the satchel, withdrawing the small stone, and dropped it into Lydus's hand, then paused.
Ugh, what's wrong with your fur?
Lydus studied his arm, the silver fur slowly changing to a dark soot-like gray.
Whoa.
His ears perked up. The stone began to glow a faint yellow.
Well, we have the right stone. Here, take it back.
She ignored him, looking at the cave walls.
Hey, Lydus, look at this.
He looked up, seeing hundreds of drawings.
Wow, these look like they haven't been touched in hundreds of years. Look at this,
he said, pointing to a handprint on the wall. Celia studied it, placing her hand over the print.
These have no thumbs. They look more like our feet than hands. But that doesn't make any sense.
She pulled her hand away, looking down at more markings on the wall.
Look, this looks like a worm.
Lydus frowned.
No, that's the parasite. And here.
He moved his hand to a picture of 5 figures.
These are the shamans and their stones. The red, yellow, and green are clear. But I don't know who these last 2 are.
Celia brushed her hand over the remaining 2 figures.
The blue is the stone of power. The brown...
Lydus studied her face. He knew it. She knew something about the shamans. This was more than Esmeralda and Flynn's knowledge. She had some sort of connection to them. The brown one in particular.
Stone of what?
Nothing. Don't worry about it. It's not important right now. The yellow stone is what matters. Here, chuck it back in the bag.
Celia, if it's something that's bothering you, tell me. What do you know?
Lydus said, placing the stone back into the bag.
Lydus, I don't know any more than you. I'm just a little shaken up is all.
He nodded as the sun sunk below the horizon and the cave drifted into darkness. She wasn't a very good liar, but given the events of the day, this wasn't the time to push her for an answer. Celia yawned.
Well, we better get some rest. Wake me when the next moon rises. I'll take the next watch.
Lydus chuckled.
All you Feralata are the same. I'll always have to take the second watch.
Shut up. How's your fur feeling? Looks like it's returned to normal.
It feels fine, although I still feel like my tail is constantly twisted.
Lydus said, looking out of the cave into the fading daylight, looking up at the first moon. Lydus studied his fur once more. It had restored to its original color.
I hope the others made it out.
Shifting his focus towards the entrance, flakes of snow began falling from the sky, the sign of a long and cold night ahead. Although it wasn't uncommon for snow to fall in the highlands, he still had his summer fur. Lydus crouched, using his armor to shield the wind as it howled through the entrance of the cave. Shivering, he rubbed his arms as the wind felt like knives as it parted his fur and ran along his skin. He peered back at Celia, the dim light making her huddled ball-like body barely visible. Her tail wrapped around her face. The clouds began to part, and moonlight reflected off the ice forming on her leather garments. He turned back, facing into the dark of the plagued lands. As the wind continued to batter him about, the need to sleep became overpowering. Fighting every nod of his head, he microslept whenever his eyes closed. In a desperate attempt to stay awake, he turned back towards Celia. With a swift and careful movement of his hand, he brushed the snow clear of the bag, reaching inside, and took hold of the stone. A small yellow glow began emanating from its smooth shape, illuminating Lydus's fur. Again it began to change color, slowly working its way up his arm and covering his whole body. The stone's light extinguished, plunging the cave into a seemingly endless darkness. Lydus brushed the snow from his fur. He spun around, shivers running up his spine, his ears up and alert. An uneasy silence descended on the cave. The howling wind had ceased, the crispness of the night air gone.
Celia,
he muttered, trying to make something out in the darkness. A stale smell drifted across his nose. The plagued had found them.
Celia, wake up! Plagued!
He shouted, reaching for his sword. Again he span on the spot, trying to make something out. 2 large red eyes appeared, followed by the sounds of husky breathing. The plagued Canid approached, its steps sounding staggered. The stone began to glow once more, illuminating the figure.
Celia?
He called out. The young Ferralata stood before him. This made no sense. Only moments ago she was sleeping on the floor of the cave, and her once black and golden fur now appeared mangy, balding in places. Her eyes glowing a deep red, and a bloodied wound was visible on her stomach. Lydus backed against the cave wall, tripping over a large mass and falling flat on his back. Landing in a drift of snow, he looked up at the drawings on the wall in the dim light of the stone. The drawing of a primitive Canid on all fours came to life, prancing along the wall. The parasite combined with the Canid, raising it off its front legs. Then the drawings of the 5 stones illuminated, and the image repeated with the new Canid. The cave plunged into darkness. Lydus released his grip on the stone. The blue glow from the moon returned, illuminating the cave once more.
What are you doing? You just kicked me in the head, you idiot!
Celia shouted. Lydus rolled over, feeling the weight of his armor on the slippery surface as he climbed back to his feet.
Sorry. The stone!
He dropped to his knees in a panic, frantically searching through the snow.
I dropped the stone!
Wait, what do you mean you dropped the stone? It's right...
She began to feel around in the bag.
It's not here. What happened?
She glared at him with the empty bag in one hand, rubbing her muzzle with the other.
I had it, and then I saw the plagued. I tripped, and the drawings on the wall came alive.
This added insult to injury. The plagued were not here, and he sounded like he was hallucinating. Spotting the stone, Celia dropped to her knees and placed it back in the bag. As Lydus watched on, he noticed something. The stone had no effect on her. It didn't even begin to glow. Celia dusted the snow off her armor and slipped it over her head. She walked to the cave's entrance, peering out to the dark snowscape, then turned back to face Lydus.
The second moon is rising now anyway. I'll take the watch.
Already?
Surely half the night hadn't already gone, had it? Regardless, she was right. Its light now blanketed the highlands. Lydus nodded, shifting his weight out of the snow, and he sat against the cave's wall, looking back at Celia's silhouette in the dim light. The wind howled across the cave's entrance, her good ear and tail flapping in the gale.
Celia, you don't strike me as the type who would commit a crime serious enough to warrant a suicide mission like this. Esmeralda was a thief, and Flynn was most likely a bandit. What did you do?
She turned her head and looked down. A pain-filled sigh escaped her.
I'm not entirely innocent, but...
She swallowed.
It's not me I'm here for.
The glimmer of a tear in the moonlight ran down her muzzle. She looked back at Lydus, wiping it from the fur on her cheek.
What did you do?
Lydus swallowed.
Do you want the long version or the short?
Celia looked back into the darkness.
The long version. We have the rest of the night.
He sighed.
The plague was found in the town of Kualpa. We were ordered to purge the town. Nobody was to survive, and we were to burn everything with the exception of an old guard tower for some reason. I was confronted. A child. He was sickly. It was obvious the parasite had begun to take over his body, but something came over me. I was unable to follow my orders.
Celia turned to face him.
Treason,
she muttered. Lydus nodded.
My daughter. I'm here for her.
Celia mumbled as she turned back around. The wind abruptly stopped and an eerie silence drifted across the cave. The scent of the plague slowly filled the air. Celia's sorrowing posture now changed to one of a more serious stance, her good ear standing on end and tail still. Lydus quietly made his way to his feet, unsheathing his sword and moving to her side.
Can you see anything?
He whispered, squinting into the darkness.
No, nothing. Just the scent.
She lifted her muzzle into the air and began to sniff.
Smells like Flynn,
she said, whipping her eyes. Lydus's ears pricked. She was right. His scent drifted across the cave. Perhaps he had been chased and he was looking for a place to seek shelter. The sounds of shuffling feet and heavy breathing filled the air. A large silhouette appeared before the cave, standing in a hunched-over posture.
Flynn, up here.
His head lifted, revealing 2 glowing red eyes. Then 2 more smaller figures appeared, each copying the plagued Canid. Lydus gulped, slowly raising his weapon. Celia followed, her armor rattling slightly with every passing moment.
That isn't Flynn anymore. You okay?
Lydus whispered. Celia glanced up.
Yeah, just scared is all.
Lydus nodded.
Just like before, okay? Follow my instructions and we'll get out of here alive. Wait for them to make the move and don't take on Flynn.
Lydus kept his gaze firmly on Flynn. He stood still, making odd, primitive noises, and his body jolting as if he had been tied to something. Lydus gripped the sword tightly, feeling the adrenaline running through his body once more, the urge to sleep now non-existent. The first of the smaller Canids lunged forward. Lydus thrust his sword, making impact with its chest, the force knocking him off balance on the slippery surface. With a large gash in its chest, it turned on Celia. As it raced towards her, she swung her blade, making contact. The sounds of bone splintering and skin tearing echoed off the wall of the cave. Its head broke free from its body, landing in the snow, and its eyes slowly dimmed, fading into the darkness. The next Canid charged at Lydus. He raised his blade, watching the Canid impale itself on his sword, the blood draining out, darkening the snow.
That was easy,
Celia stated, panting heavily.
Flynn's the one we have to worry about. Don't underestimate him. The other 2 were just peasants like the others back at the pass.
Lydus's gaze now firmly fixed on Flynn. Unlike the peasants, Flynn's body hadn't begun to decay yet. Lydus had seen something similar once before, near Penshaw. A large farmer who had turned, and for some reason his strength had doubled, leaving one of his group with a broken back. It had taken 4 Canids to take him down. Right now it was just Celia and himself. A gust of wind howled across the opening, the foul stench lifting from his presence.
Lydus, what's he doing? Maybe he hasn't turned yet. Flynn, fight it!
She fails to see that there is no coming back from this. Celia, he's gone. There's nothing we can do for him now.
Flynn paced forward towards the cave and reached behind his back, pulling a large dark blade from his holster. Lydus's head jolted backward in shock.
Already? He has a parasitic blade already?
The plagued were intelligent, but to target them like this? At the worst, Flynn would only have had his hands, but a sword changed the game.
Celia, if he knocks me down, you run, okay?
As she nodded, Flynn rushed forward. Lydus swung his sword, meeting Flynn's with a loud swing. Celia rushed him from the side, jamming her blade into the side of his stomach. Flynn roared out in pain as Lydus swung his blade once more, but slipped on the icy ground, sliding down the hill. He looked at Celia, watching her pull the blade from Flynn's side, just in time to block his strike. Celia struggled against his sides, slowly getting crushed by the force of his arms.
Lydus, help!
She called as he began to push harder. Lydus jumped to his feet and charged at Flynn, forcing his blade down hard against the plagued Canids' wrists. Flynn howled as the sound of steel and flesh connected. He recoiled, throwing Celia against the cave wall. Flynn looked up at Lydus, his eyes firmly fixed on him.
I'm sorry, Flynn,
he said, as he forced his sword through Flynn's chest. He coughed and spluttered, then his eyes began to dim. Lydus looked towards Celia. The silhouette of the Ferrolata panted heavily in the moonlight.
Are you okay?
She swallowed, whimpering in her breath as she sat up.
Yeah, I think I'm fine. Was one of them Essie?
Lydus shook his head. Something seemed wrong.
No, I can't smell her either.
He looked back at the Ferrolata.
We gotta move, though.
Celia stood with a blank expression on her face.
How did he change so fast?
Lydus looked down at the Lycian's body.
Sometimes the parasite can take control really fast. Must be something to do with the mind.
Celia sighed.
What do we do with his body?
Her words short and sharp, almost pained, probably from the impact with the wall. Lydus looked around.
There isn't a lot we can do right now. If we don't move soon, we will be found by a lot more than 3.
I have to get the stone,
Celia muttered, hobbling into the cave. She disappeared into the darkness momentarily, then reappeared in the cave's entrance.
I got it,
she stated, then lost her footing and slipped, falling face first into the snow, exhaling a loud yelp.
Ah!
Celia?
Lydus called, now making his way up towards the cave's entrance. He grabbed the shoulders of the girl, pulling her to her feet. She hunched over, gripping her stomach with her hand.
I fell on something sharp. I can't see what it is.
For a moment, the snow stopped falling, and in the break in the weather, moonlight shone onto them, revealing the bloody mess from the battle and Flynn's dark blade. Lydus reached for her hand, moving it away from the wound. In the dim light, he could make out the small glimmer of blood oozing from a small gap in her armor, the fur around it slightly soaked in the warm dampness. Celia looked up, tears immediately rolling down her muzzle.
You got to put me down.
He bent down, removing the knife from the holster on his pants. He lifted its shirt, placing the knife into the fabric and slowly tearing it along the seams.
No, the stone. Arnold said its power was unknown. We may be able to save you. We just have to get you back to Creysil.
If there was any way of saving her, it had to do with the stone. Nothing else had ever stopped the transformation once the parasite had entered a Canid's body. Celia nodded, lifting the armor, exposing the dimly lit white fur on her chest. She grimaced as Lydus tied the bandage tightly around it.
You all right? I didn't mean to hurt you.
She huffed and pointed to her head, and with a smug tone in her voice muttered,
Look at my ear. That hurt. This is only a flesh wound.
He said nothing, picking up the bag and tossing it to her, almost knocking her off her feet. As the pair set off into the night, he hoped they would make it back in time. With each passing day, Celia's condition worsened. The wound began to appear infected. None of her usual medicines assisted. She began to look continuously tired and in pain. By the 9th day in the plagued lands, she was hobbling, struggling to continue. The going had been slow, partially because of her condition, and the rest due to the barren snowscape. Lydus's steps were heavy, his eyes now straining and the constant thought of sleep on his mind. He looked back at Celia. Her fur had begun to turn mangy, with a distinct scent of rotting flesh slowly filling the air.
She's really struggling. I hope the stone can do something. It has to be the infection.
He climbed onto a log and scanned the surrounds, spotting the remains of an old building. Lydus closed his eyes, listening for danger.
Nothing. Looks like our luck is finally turning.
Celia looked at him but said nothing. He pointed at the building.
I think we both need a rest. I haven't exactly slept.
Celia nodded, walking past him, clutching at her stomach. The building was old but mostly intact. A slight collapse had occurred on the second floor, snow filling the hole into the loft. Its stone walls covered in dead moss, and the wooden door in a largely dilapidated state. Lydus gripped the handle, shaking it. Celia looked at the handle.
It's obviously locked,
she muttered. Lydus gave it a firm push, hearing the wood crack with his force. He released the belt holding his chain armor together, then walked back away from the door. Placing some distance between himself and the door, he turned around as Celia leaned against the wall. Taking in a deep breath, he sprinted, placing his shoulder into its fragile handle. It splintered into pieces, with Lydus landing on the floor on the adjacent side in a cloud of dust. He coughed and sat up.
That was a little weaker than I was expecting.
He pushed himself off the floor and studied the surrounds. An old table, cooking utensils in a cupboard, a jar with what appeared to be clothing or bedding. A distant rumble of thunder drew his attention. He turned for the door, spotting a series of dark clouds rolling up from their intended path. He turned to Celia.
Looks like we may have to stay here a little longer than expected.
She nodded and hobbled into the building. Lydus followed, upturning the table and pushing it to cover the hole where the remains of the door stood. Celia sat down near the cupboard, looking at a ladder into the collapsed loft.
How far do you think it is until we get back to Creysil?
Lydus took hold of it, stomping his foot on the lower rung to check its strength.
About half a day's hike and we'll be home safe. I thought I could see a town before. Dracot or Seaster, perhaps. I'll see if I can make my way onto the roof to confirm. Have you got any food left?
Celia reached into the bag, feeling around, then nodding her head.
Yeah, not much, but enough.
She withdrew her hand from the bag. The stone crashed onto the wooden floor and rolled into the center of the room. Lydus let go of the ladder, reaching down to pick up the stone. It began to glow and the room flashed to black. He looked at his fur, now the soot-colored gray once more. Darkness engulfed all light with the exception of a door no further than a few steps in front of him. He had stepped forward, walking into a small room, and before him a bed. He knew this place. It had burnt into his mind. He was powerless, a passenger in his own body. A small cough erupted from beneath the sheets. Lydus stepped forward, extending an arm towards the sickly pup. A vulpus, red fur and white belly. His small, pointy black ears drooped, his eyes tinged orange in color and heavy, appearing to glow.
"Papa?"
the child asked. Lydus said nothing. He just stared. The boy coughed violently.
"You are going to make me and Mama better?"
He nodded, turning around, pushing a door open.
Corporal Aras, you get back in that room and do as you have been ordered!
Lydus looked at the faceless silhouette.
Sir, I won't kill a child. Not one still living. Not one still breathing. Not one who was asking for his mom and dad. If you want him dead for the greater good, do it yourself.
The silhouette pushed him back into the room, taking hold of Lydus's hand, and thrust it forward, forcing the blade into the boy's throat. The boy's pupils narrowed. He began to cough and splutter, falling out of the bed onto the stone floor. Blood spilt from the hole in his neck as he began to gasp. Lydus looked on in horror. Cold flushes ran wild through his body. He didn't want to do this. He didn't want to see this. Dropping to his knees, he grabbed the child, holding his hand over his neck in a worthless attempt to stem the flow of blood. The boy's eyes dimmed and began to grow cloudy. He stopped gasping, with only little spasms escaping the dying corpse. Lydus looked up at the faceless silhouette, yelling out,
"I'm not your puppet!"
Then he saw it. The figure, that shaman now standing before him. Somehow, for some reason, Lydus wasn't the puppet. His superior was. Lydus dropped the body, climbing to his feet. A new darkness fell upon the room as the shaman turned and headed for the door. His heart burned, his palms sweaty and tightened around the blade of his weapon.
"Don't walk away from me! You set me up! You took it all!"
He shouted, watching his superior leave the room. He ran forward, driving the blade through the figure. It fell limp and crashed to the floor in a pool of blood. Lydus stood, hunched and breathing heavily. It had only become clear now. The shaman had a connection to them all, and it was all because of the stone. His imprisonment was no accident. Another voice shouted,
"Corporal Arish, what have you done? Corporal Arish? Corporal!"
How could he have been so stupid?
Lydus!
How could he have not seen it?
Lydus!
Why did he have to relive that again? He turned towards the voice, now seeing Celia in the darkness, her eyes glowing red, and the scent of the plague on his nose. He dropped the stone, reality restored. A loud crack of thunder echoed within the building. The wind howled, pushing the table from the doorway. He quickly ran towards the door, forcing the table back into place, stopping the influx of snow. Celia coughed a cough just as violent as that of the child. He turned around, seeing her slump forward.
"Celia!"
he shouted, running over to her, laying her on her back. He raced to the cupboard, grabbing a moth-eaten blanket, tossing it over her. Panicking, he raced for the door, running out into the snowscape.
"Why am I here? Why are you making me do this again?"
he shouted, his voice echoing across the tundra. Lydus turned, looking back at the decrepit building, beginning to disappear in the snowstorm, closing his eyes for a moment and taking a deep breath. Walking back inside, he looked at Celia, studying her stomach, withdrawing his dagger and cutting the bandage from her belly. A small puncture wound was visible through her fur, surrounded by black mildew-smelling skin. He wiped her eyes, then brushed his hand along her muzzle. Her nose, it was dry. Her eyes now beginning to turn orange and glow a tinged red. It was too late. She had begun to turn and had lost the will to live. He had to find out what she knew. This mission had been a setup. He didn't care what Flynn or Esmeralda had done. They appeared to have been in just as difficult a position as he was. What was she hiding?
"Celia, tell me what you really know. Please, what is the brown stone?"
he asked in a gentle tone as he brushed her hair with his hand.
Lydus, it's called the Stone of Bereavement. It was my partner's. I didn't want to say anything because I didn't think you would trust me.
This was the answer. She had a direct connection to all the stones. He looked at the yellow stone.
"It's connected to this one?"
She nodded.
They're all connected to the Stone of Power. Without every stone, the plague cannot be stopped.
"What does it matter, Celia? You're infected. You're going to become one of them."
She coughed again, lifting her hand and brushing the fur on the side of his face.
What did Arnold say about the stone?
Celia asked, beginning to shiver. Lydus lifted his armor off his body, letting it crash to the ground.
"He said what it does is the real question."
Lydus bent down, pulling Celia's armor off, then positioned his body under her head, propping it up into his lap.
Lydus, I'm beyond help, and we have both seen that stone does nothing to me if I touch it. Only you. Do what has been asked. Help the rest of us. There is no hope if you don't return.
Lydus smiled a fake smile, brushing the fur aside her face.
"Tell me about your daughter,"
he said, taking the dagger silently in hand.
She's not normal,
Celia muttered.
Her name is Ellie.
She coughed again, now even more violently than the previous times before, each cough causing her to grimace with pain.
"What do you mean she isn't normal?"
Lydus asked, stroking her hair.
She's a mule bred. She had my body but the ears of her father, a jackal, daughter of a shaman. Her father was killed by a shaman.
She coughed.
The shaman of Remorse, and he framed me for the murder. Ellie was never meant to exist.
A tear ran down her cheek, dripping onto her hand.
I'll never see my Ellie again.
The redness in her eyes began to intensify, her breaths short and sharp. Her heart rate continued to increase, every breath sounding pain-filled.
Lydus.
Her voice now almost non-existent.
Yes, Celia?
Do you think Ezzy made it?
She gripped his hand tightly, her eyes closed, and tears continued to run down her cheeks.
Yeah, I bet she's not far away.
Lydus gripped the knife tight, lifting it to her chest. Soft, sharp, pain-filled breaths filled the air. Celia's hand fell limp as she slipped from consciousness. He knew what was about to become of her, the parasitic monster consuming her body. The stone had shown him the future, what she would become if he didn't act now. The choice he couldn't carry out with the child now had to be made with Celia. With the stone's purpose and importance finally clear, he closed his eyes, squeezing them tightly.
I'll find your daughter, Celia. When I do, I'll make sure she gets what you were chasing for her.
Forcing the blade into her heart, she winced a final breath and fell silent. Lydus stood over the freshly disturbed dirt with a heavy heart. He picked up Celia's sword, withdrawing it from its sheath and stabbing it into the ground. Wiping a tear from his eye, he walked back towards the building, picking up Celia's satchel, checking he had the stone, then attached it to his belt. With one final look at her grave, he lifted his nose to the air, sniffing it to check for plague. A lone figure caught his attention in the distance. The silhouette began to approach slowly and cautiously. Lydus withdrew his sword, ready to strike, taking refuge adjacent to the building.
Kingtail?
The figure yelled. Lydus jumped up. It was Esmeralda. She was alive against all the odds.
Over here.
He wasn't the only one to survive. What joy he had was drowned out by the lowly look on her face. She collapsed a few meters from him, breathing heavily and exhausted.
Where's Celia?
She asked after a short pause. Lydus looked at the sword positioned in the freshly disturbed dirt.
She didn't make it.
Esmeralda frowned, shaking her head.
They got my Flynn, too.
She slumped to the ground, beginning to weep. Should he tell her what happened? No, it would break her. The outgoing, overzealous Brachyurus she once was now gone, leaving her a blubbering mess on the ground next to him. Lydus placed his hand on her back in an attempt to comfort her. He sat on the ground adjacent her, continuing to pet her back, looking to the south. Smoke began to rise just near the horizon, and the scent of burning fur filled the air in the distance. He heard a distant but familiar sound. The crown's horn, and the silhouettes of 6 riders on horseback.
Arnold. But how did he know where we were?
His thoughts halted, coming to the conclusion. The shaman of Remorse. He must have known. That's how Arnold knew. He turned to Esmeralda and smiled a long and pain-filled smile of relief.
We made it.
Day one, here I am on my own without you, wishing that didn't go. Day two, same again, comes and goes, breaks my heart, no one knew. Didn't wanna go, 'cause I'm out here wanna go. 'Cause out here, I'm all alone. Didn't wanna go. I wanna turn back the time and let you know to come home. Kiss you, so you come home.